We left off at, we covered verse down through verse 8, and a lot of this section we kind of been talking about together as almost as a collective whole, because he's talking about the superiority of the new sanctuary, the spiritual sanctuary, talking about, of course, the covenant of Christ. And that's what really this entire book essentially is about, is contrasting the covenant of Christ in this particular context with the law of Moses, but as we have pointed out numerous times, to contrast it with anything. And the idea is Jesus' covenant, his sacrifice, everything is better, superior. And so that's this section that we're looking at here in chapter 9, this superior, in this particular, about to get to the superior sanctuary under the new covenant, but he's looking here particularly in verses 1 through 10 at the inferior. And again, we will come at some point and look at maybe, I'm still trying to decide how I want to do that, because it's, I don't want to just spend a ton of time. We could probably take several class periods and talk about that typology. But we will at some point talk about the typology of that Old Testament tabernacle. But I don't want to get too off track from our Hebrews study because we want to, continue on with that. I feel sort of like the writer, as he says, of which we cannot now speak particularly. It's not that he couldn't have elaborated on it, but he says, hey, I want to hasten to get to the point that we're trying to make. And that's sort of how I feel, with this study. Sometimes I want to just park it and talk and teach for weeks on a particular verse or two. But I don't want to run out of time, and I don't want to lose the big picture either. So anyways, verse 9 is where we're picking up where we left off 2 weeks ago. He's talking, again, in this section, the inferiority of that Old Testament tabernacle. Just to back up a little bit and get more of the context before we just pick up in the middle of verse 9, he says, talking about the cherubim of glory shadowing the mercy seat, verse 5, of which we cannot now speak particularly. Now when these things were thus ordained, the priests went always into the first tabernacle, accomplishing the service of God. In other words, this was not a one-day-a-year thing. If you were a priest, you were in what we would call the holy place, well, every day, right? And even on the Sabbath. And Jesus is going to talk about that. In fact, we've talked about it in our questions Jesus asked class on Sunday morning, where Jesus points out they tried to criticize Jesus' disciples for going through a field of grain, grabbing a few heads of grain and sort of rubbing them together and getting the seed, almost like just a little snack as you're walking through a grain field. Oh, they violated the Sabbath, as if that somehow is tantamount to sowing, or not sowing, but reaping and threshing. Oh, you've done work on the Sabbath. How could you do that? And Jesus points out their inconsistency with regard to David, who actually did violate the Sabbath, but he also points out, hey, the priests, they profane the Sabbath, and the word profane there, not meaning, we sometimes use that to mean profane in the sense of sin, but he means that it becomes common to them because that's a big work day for them, right? So the priests went always, is the way it's worded in the King James, into the first tabernacle, accomplishing the service of God. But into the second went the high priest alone. Nobody else, just him. And of course, once every year. No more than that, lest he die. He also was not to go without blood. That's, you wouldn't even think about that if you were the high priest. I'm going to go into the Day of Atonement. I'm going to go into the most holy place. But I'm just, I'm kind of tired of all this animal sacrifice. I'm just not going to go with blood this year. Well, it would only happen once. So he goes in, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the errors of the people. And when we pointed out errors of the people there, Greek word signifying errors or sins committed in ignorance. These are, mistakes that they had made in ignorance. Now he says, verse 8, the Holy Ghost or Holy Spirit, this signifying that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest, while as the first tabernacle was yet standing, which, first tabernacle, was a figure for the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that did the service perfect as pertaining to the conscience. Then he goes on and says this, which stood only in meats and drinks and diverse washings, carnal ordinances imposed on them until the time of Reformation. I've got this down a little bit further, but I'm going to go ahead and mention it now. If you notice, again, we've pointed out before that italicized words, at least when it comes to the King James, the New King James, and American Standard, I think those are, I know those three versions do, but I'm not sure if there are others that do that as well. But those italicized words mean that they were added by the translators. And you see that in verse 10, those two words at the beginning, which stood, they are italicized. Let me get it for comparison's sake. Concerned. That's what I was just trying to get to, verse 10. Since they relate is how the New American Standard puts it. Some of these versions have it in paragraph form. It's hard to find the verse sometimes. Being only carnal ordinances and so on is what the ASV starts out with, being only. And then I had the New King James. You said it a while ago, Chris. What'd you say? Concerned. And ESV says, but deal only with. I think it's pretty, it's not one of those big deals, but just reading it without the italicized words, which was a figure for the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that did the service perfect as pertaining to the conscience, only in meats and drinks and diverse washes. In other words, it couldn't make him perfect, complete, whole, in that sense pertaining to the conscience, but it did in relation to meats, drinks, diverse washings, carnal ordinances, so on. Again, it's a contrast, right, between what the blood of Christ can do versus what could be effected and accomplished by that old covenant that was, again, as he's pointing out in this section, inferior. So he shows that here in verses 9 and 10 that the old covenant sanctuary was inferior because it was ineffective for cleansing people's hearts in the sense of to the point of the conscience, that inner cleansing. He says that they were a figure, that tabernacle was a figure for the time then present. Again, seems intended here to contrast that old tabernacle with this more perfect system. And again, assuming that's correct, he's saying the Jewish ritual could not be seen as inferior until it's put in contrast with the new covenant. In other words, if you were living under the law of Moses, was it inferior? Not at all. Because that was what God had commanded. That was what he gave. That was the law he gave the people. Was it inferior? But when the law of Christ came, fulfilling, superseding the law of Moses, now put side by side, it's no comparison, right? The law of Christ is so much better, so superior. So it seems that that's what the writer here is saying by inspiration. Now he mentions there also in verse 9, sacrifices, gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that did the service perfect as pertaining to the conscience. Again, there's this remembrance of sins every single year. They remember the sins. There's the Day of Atonement. There are these ongoing sacrifices. But there's a remembrance. The real barrier to then and now, the real barrier to free, total access to God is inward, right? I think we all understand that. And that's the point that he's getting at here. You can't approach God freely without a purified, cleansed heart or conscience. The blood of Christ does that for us. And there's not a need for a remembrance every year, because it is a once-for-all sacrifice, as he'll say a little bit later in this very chapter. I mean, that's one of those things that just, Bob, I think it was your email today. Thank you, by the way. I've got a couple of your pictures that I borrowed. I appreciate that. But I think it was in that email you said something about reading the book again recently, the book of Hebrews, and there are things in here that just, sometimes I just say to myself, let that sink in. And you think about to have that free, unfettered access to approach the throne of God, you've got to deal with the heart, the conscience. They never really had that full access to God under the old covenant. Even the high priest, it was only once a year, one day, and they had to repeat it over and over every single year. I mean, think about the blessing that we have. I hadn't forgot you, Bob. I do want to notice this because it just reminded me of something that Robert said not last week, 2 weeks ago. Turn to Matthew chapter 11. Robert made this point, and I wrote it down on my notes that night, but then I printed a new page of notes tonight, and I almost forgot, Robert. But, man, this is a good point. And somebody, just whenever you get there, read Matthew 11, verse 11. We sometimes read this verse and we kind of go, well, why is Jesus saying that? What does that mean? Man, sometimes you read the book of Hebrews, and I'm like Robert. Robert was mentioning this last week. We were talking about it after class, and he said, wow, no wonder Jesus said that. You just, again, it's one of those, you let it sink in. Such a better system. Who's got it? 11:11. Okay, David.
Verily, I say unto you, among them that are born of women, there hath not life risen a greater than John the Baptist. Notwithstanding he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he.
All right, so without getting into a big, long discussion of Matthew 11 here, it seems at least, well, it is 100% possible. It seems likely to me. Some people, say, I don't think John was doubting here. I think he's trying to get his disciples to see. Maybe. I can't say 100% certainty. We can't say either way 100% for certain. But it seems that John does have some doubts, and so he sends some of his disciples to Jesus to ask, are you the Christ, or should we look for another? And Jesus gives again, if I'm right on that line of thinking, Jesus gives a mild, I wouldn't even call it a rebuke. I would call it more of a reproof, right? And he says, you go tell John the things that you've seen, these miracles that are done. And blessed is he that is not offended in me. But again, if I'm right in that line of thinking, as they departed, Jesus begins to talk to the multitudes about John. It's almost like he begins to brag on John, lest anybody think that reproof was somehow him saying, come on, John, like he's just really castigating him. Oh, no, far from it. He says, what'd you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaking with the wind? That's not John. Oh, did you go out to see somebody clothed in soft raiment? That ain't John. And he says, I'll tell you something about John. Among those born of women, there has not arisen a greater prophet than John. I mean, that's pretty amazing, right? Notwithstanding, what? He that is least in the kingdom is greater than John. I don't know about you, but I read about John and his courage, his conviction, his dedication, even when, quite literally, we use this term metaphorically sometimes, but for John it was far from metaphorical. Quite literally, it cost him his head. And he stood firm. I don't know about you, but I look at John and I go, I'm far from that. And yet Jesus says, if you're least in the kingdom, you're greater than John. If you've ever read that verse and wondered, how would Jesus say that? Read the book of Hebrews. And hear the Holy Spirit telling us through the pen of whoever it was that wrote this book. The Spirit is telling us, Jesus is better. Better than what? Yes. Anything. Anyone, anything. Jesus is better. And I mean, his sacrifice, his tabernacle, you name it. It is 1,000% better. No wonder Jesus made that statement. And again, we've mentioned this before, a statement that Cliff Goodwin made when we were talking about the book of Hebrews with a few different preachers sitting around one day. He said, think about, sometimes people almost want to throw out the book of Hebrews because we don't know 100% for sure who the author, human penman was. Think about the hole that would be in the canon of the New Testament without this book. Matthew 11:11, that statement comes alive when you read the book of Hebrews, for sure. Bob, go ahead. You were going to make a point a while ago.
Touching the conscience, making the worshiper perfect. What we would give for a clear conscience if we meditated on what it means to have a forgiven, clear conscience, and we could communicate that to this community. We could not have a church building big enough to hold the people that come. That's how powerful that verse is. Are there not people out there that think they have a clear conscience, but really they don't, and they're just sort of deceiving themselves? This passage provides a way, if we just knew how to communicate that and teach folks properly, I believe that is extremely important matter.
Absolutely. I mean, as you said, what people wouldn't give, many people wouldn't give for a clear, clean conscience. And, it was like a required course in high school, English literature. So we had to study Shakespeare. And I was one of those weirdos that I loved that section. I love the writings of Shakespeare. It's not always the easiest English to read, I'll grant you that. But I really enjoy that. And there's a scene, though, in Macbeth after they've killed the king, right? I hadn't read it in years. But she's consumed with guilt, Lady Macbeth. And she talks about wash, can't get the blood off her hands. Well, it's not talking about physical blood. It's talking about she wants a clean conscience. And and we have that under the law, the covenant of Christ. Was somebody else going to say something a while ago? I thought I saw a hand go up. Okay, so going into verse 10, as I pointed out, the which stood there is italicized. I don't know that it changes a whole lot, but it does seem to emphasize that contrast between fleshly, physical cleansing versus the inward cleansing of the conscience. It mentions diverse washings, divers or diverse, same idea there. There were literally a plethora of washings under the law of Moses, right? We won't go and read all these passages, but there was washing for the high priest. Leviticus 16:4 and 24. There were washings for the priests. Exodus 30, 18 through 21. Leviticus 8:6. Washings for the Levites. Numbers 8, 6, and 7. Washings for lepers. Washings for unclean persons. Read about those, Leviticus 14, 8, and 9. Washings for garments, washings for vessels, Leviticus 6, 27 and 28. Yet, nothing, none of that made the conscience clean. No wonder when put side by side with the law of Christ, that system is so vastly inferior. Again, you couldn't see that until the law of Christ comes. It wasn't inferior in their time, but now, writing when the law of Christ is in effect and has superseded, annulled, fulfilled the law of Moses, he said there's no comparison. And then he mentions in verse 10, until the time of Reformation. This Greek word is the idea of straightening, restoring something to a right condition, or Reformation is another way it's often translated as it is here in the King James. Again, showing the gospel system to be better. It's Albert Barnes puts it this way, talking about this idea of the time of Reformation. He says it's a time of putting things where they ought to be. We sometimes use that expression. I don't know if it's a Southern expression or just a kind of a general figure of speech or figurative phrase, but sometimes we'll say, set things aright. We're going to go, in fact, what is it? I heard it sometime it was either a television show or a movie where it's kind of like a cowboy, old Western type thing, and somebody says, oh, we're going to this place. If you want to go ride with us, we're going to go set things aright. And the idea is you come with us, you can help us, you can set things like they ought to be. That's the idea in this word. It's diorthosis, if I'm saying that right. But that's the idea, straightening, restoring something to the right condition. Again, it's indicative that the law of Moses was never intended to last forever until the time of Reformation. So again, what a blessing to live in the time, as he puts it, of Reformation, right? The time of having things restored to their right conditions. This was what God was intending all along. In fact, Paul's going to talk about this in Romans chapter 10 when he says, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. And he goes on to say, I bear them record, they